Hey, welcome everyone on this hot day. Thank you so much for coming today. And I think with a fresh memory of the No King protests, it's very timely to be together here for a book presentation about international protest movements. And especially, I would add, if it is written by someone as insightful and brilliant as Jeff Wasserstrom. So thank you for being here, Jeff. And I would also say that in a daily reality where we see mass people without identification throwing people into unmarked vans, it's really important to look at international and historical examples and see how people with more experience of authoritarianism have dealt with such situations. So very little about the book because I know you are going to talk about it extensively. The Milk Tea Alliance Inside Asia's Struggle Against Autocracy in Beijing deals with protest movements in Hong Kong, Thailand and Burma. And it shows the regional and national peculiarities, but also some very interesting parallels and connections between them in terms of democratic aims, but also the use of symbols, the use of songs, the use of inspirational examples, etc. 3 months ago, we presented here another book presentation by Melissa Chen, the journalist, and Chinese dissident artist Badiou Tao, who together wrote a graphic novel, You Must Take Part in Revolution. It is about 3 young people in Hong Kong dealing with the new fascist international world order. And I would say that today's book in some ways resonates with that graphic novel as well. I'm also very happy that we are joined today with Sasha Razor, who will be in conversation with Jeff. Sasha is an old friend of the museum and also personally, I would add, and among many, many other things, also a specialist in the protest movements in Belarus. I will say a few words to officially introduce them. Jeff Wasserstrom is Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine. His previous books include an earlier one for Columbia Global Report called Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink from 2020. And as an editor, he worked on the Oxford History of Modern China, published in 2022. And he often writes for general interest publications and co-edits the China section of the Los Angeles Review of Books. And then for Sasha, Sasha Razor is a native of Belarus, and she received her PhD in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies from UCLA. She is a lecturer in Germanic and Slavic Studies and Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. And her research interests include avant-garde cinema and literature, Belarusian and Ukrainian culture, migration and diaspora studies. And last but not least, I would like to thank our incredible Wende team here, including Rachel, Maggie, Isaac, Clara, Wally, and all the others, for making these programs possible. Also a shout out to LA East, who is the official media sponsor for today's program, and Maya and Renee Luskin for supporting the program series. And with that, without further ado, please take the floor.
So thank you everyone for coming here today. I know that the parking situation is atrocious, and I want to say that we do appreciate you being here. We would like to begin today's talk with playing you a very short music video so you have a sense, a feel of what is it that Jeff will be talking about and connect to the material a little bit. So please. Thank you, thank you. So, Jeff, ready? So let's start with just you telling us a little bit about the video that we've seen and how it relates to your research on this book.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's a great honor to be here, and this is the perfect kind of venue to have this discussion and the perfect person to be having it with. But seeing that clip, first of all, there were just things that I think in terms of the contemporary resonances to the United States, if you looked at the list of grievances and concerns, there was a lot that I wanted to kind of de-exoticize from the beginning the stories about East Asia and Southeast Asia that are in the book, say these are things that have relevance around the world and to here. Another thing about that song is and the introduction to it, they released the single on the anniversary of an event in the history of Thailand. There's a local side to it, but the medium of music that they're using, of expression, is rap music. So there's a continual sense in which the stories I tell in the book are about global symbols, global songs, globally circulating universal concerns, and then how they're localized and take on special meanings in a region. And so in a very simple way of explaining it, which I'll give musical examples, a little bit of this too, the book grew out of my following the Hong Kong protests of 2019, which is the subject of my previous book. And the 2019 protests in Hong Kong were giant news stories, some of the biggest protests, definitely the biggest protests in the history of Hong Kong, but when they sometimes had over 1 million people on the streets of a city of 7.5 million, they were arguably some of the biggest protests in the history of the world, sustained protests, when you think about percentage of people on the streets. This was crushed, and about 5 years ago now, it's about the 5th anniversary coming up, of a national security law was imposed on Hong Kong that stifled any possibility for that kind of public action anymore. It was a kind of a recolonization of Hong Kong, this time by the Beijing government rather than earlier by the British government. And so I had just sort of finished this story of saying about Hong Kong's last effort to kind of defend rule of law, to defend separation of powers, to push for a little bit more democracy in Hong Kong, and it's crushed. And then in the fall of 2020, there started to be protests in Bangkok that I was following, and I got a sense of deja vu. The students on the streets were doing things that were very much like what had happened in Hong Kong. They were singing some of the same songs. They were singing different songs. Rap Against Dictatorship played there. Rap Against Dictatorship hadn't been part of the Hong Kong protests. But in 2019, Hong Kong people had sung Do You Hear the People Sing? And in 2020, that same song was then being sung in Thai. It had been sung in English and Cantonese in Hong Kong. It was being sung in English and Thai in Bangkok in 2020. And to me, it was like a baton had been passed in this kind of struggle for democracy relay race in Asia. And there were connections between some of the Thai students and some of the Hong Kong students. During the Hong Kong protests, some students had come up in Thailand holding solidarity with Hong Kong protests. And then when the Thai protests began, Joshua Wong, the most famous young protester in Hong Kong, before he was arrested, the last protest he did was took part in was outside of the Thai consulate in Hong Kong, protesting against police brutality in Thailand. Then early in 2021, there's a coup in Burma that halts any kind of movement toward democracy there. And suddenly there are scenes in Yangon coming from Burma that look like what had just happened in Thailand, which look like what had just happened in Hong Kong. So there was sort of a third step in the relay race. And they sang, Do You Hear the People Sing, in Burmese at that point. But they also, another connection, it's not just that things flow from the West to Asia, but they also flow within Asia. And one of the things that in Burma, there were some rappers who were inspired by Rap Against Dictatorship who founded a group called Rap Against Junta. And so there is this kind of, there's connecting thread between them, and they referred to themselves sometimes as the Milk Tea Alliance, which is a peculiar name, an odd one, but it was that all of them had, these movements to one degree or another thought that the autocrats that they were battling domestically were being supported or partly in the shadow of Beijing and partly being supported by Beijing. And there were some, this was particularly a part of the Hong Kong story, partly about the Thailand story, less about Burma, but all of them, there were some sort of online efforts by hyper-nationalists on the mainland to criticize these people who were challenging Beijing in any way. And the activists sort of who felt solidarity with each other say, well, what do we have in common besides the fact that we're for more democracy and we're worried about Beijing's rise? They said, well, we all drink our tea with milk in it, and on the mainland they don't. So we'll call ourselves the Milk Tea Alliance. Milky tea in Hong Kong, bubble tea in Taiwan was part of this too, Burmese tea, Thai tea, all of these are distinctively local forms of drinking tea. They're all different, but they all have one thing in common that connects them and separates them from the mainland. So they called themselves the Milk Tea Alliance. There were these memes online. You can see one image there. And some of them showed the 3 cups of tea swearing allegiance to each other, like Three Musketeers style, all for one, one for all. And then also in each of these places, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Burma, they all took inspiration from the Hunger Games movies were popular in all 3 of those places. And in the Hunger Games, if you haven't seen the Hunger Games, spoiler alert, close your ears, because I'll just tell you something about it. It's a group of young people from different parts of, from different territories that are in the same part of the world, and all are being oppressed by the same more kind of advanced militarily capital. And they rise up, and it's a kind of David versus Goliath story of these young people, and the spoiler is they win. They succeed in defeating the autocrats in the capital. This was very inspiring. They have a 3-finger salute, is the gesture of defiance in these places, in the movie, that all links them together, and in the novels before that. And there is also a slogan in one of them, if we burn, you burn with us. In Hong Kong in 2019, if we burn, you burn with us became a slogan from the Hunger Games. In Thailand and Burma, the 3-finger salute became important. And it was something, again, where you have something that's traveling around from different parts of the world, but takes on special meanings. So these images behind show some things like 3-finger salute with rap against junta. It shows Jennifer Lawrence in one case in the back, playing the heroine of the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen, holding up 3 fingers. And in one picture, there's her holding up 3 fingers with a slogan in Thai written over it saying, let it end with this generation. And beside that is Agnes Chow, the Hong Kong activist who I profile in the book. And she's dressed up as the hero of the Hunger Games because there was a political campaign at a moment when they thought she could be elected to the legislature, and they played on this Hunger Games thing by saying they were the Younger Games. So there's a playfulness, there's a youth movement side to it, and there's this sense of interconnectedness, of being tapped into global flows, global styles, global symbols, but also localizing them and being connected within a region.
Thank you so much. And I have to say that Jeff's book has 3 chapters on Thailand, Hong Kong, and Burma, which profiles activists, and you cannot help but connect to their stories as you read it. There is important human factor there. And once I finished your book, I was stuck with the question, okay, you finished it in November. What's happening to these folks right now? Can you update us on what they're doing and how are things back home for them?
Yeah, thanks. I'll talk about one figure who I became so fascinated by that the book almost became a biography of him. And a part of me kind of wishes I'd called it The Bookworm of Bangkok, the most interesting intellectual activist under 30 you've probably never heard of. His name is Netuit Chotafat-Faisal, and I have a lot to say about him in the book. He's a connecting thread. He's the son of shopkeepers, who's one of the best read people in the world I know right now. He founded a publishing house. He is a translator. He's written a memoir called A Bad Student in a Perfect Educational System about his time as a youth activist. It's gone through 3 editions. He's a friend of Joshua Wong, the Hong Kong activist I mentioned. He tried to bring Joshua Wong to Thailand in 2016 to talk about what people had been doing in Hong Kong that had worked, that perhaps Thailand could learn from. The Chinese authorities blocked Joshua Wong at the airport and sent him back to Hong Kong. That was a kind of Milk Tea Alliance moment before the term. The term didn't come in until 2020, but in 2016 there was a sense of connectedness there. So Netuit, he's in this picture here with a group of his friends, And they were all in a 2020 protest. And they're holding up these slogans in English and the Thai translations. And the one he's holding up says, "Be as courageous as you can." They're all things that were printed up from Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny that Netowitz Publishing House translated into Thai. And they printed up these sort of aphorisms from there in the two languages to hold in protests. In Hong Kong the year before, "Do Not Obey in Advance" is also from that same book, from the Chinese Hong Kong translation of it. So there's this kind of flow there. But what's happened since I finished the book in November? A lot's been going on. Netowitz is, among other things, Thailand's first conscientious objector. He became a monk for a little while, and he had to stop being a monk because he realized having a monk's robes would protect him from the draft, and he wanted to challenge the draft. He's convinced that his country's continual slides back into coups and never really becoming a full democracy has a lot to do with the militarization of his society. His first action was protest against military-style haircuts being enforced in schools when he was about 13 or 14. But now he's sort of pushing the military conscription thing. He's refusing the draft. And since I finished the book, he's started to go, there are court proceedings against him. So it's possible that he'll be imprisoned. He's been only detained for short amounts of time for protests earlier in his life, but he hasn't had a long prison sentence. It's possible that something will happen there. He was recently accepted into Harvard Divinity School. And so I was looking forward to, I've met him a couple of times. I was looking forward to meeting him on the East Coast when he starts at Harvard. But then I realized that he might not get there because the Thai authorities might keep him from leaving. His being a military conscription, conscientious objector is a news story in Thailand. It's not a news story in any other part of the world. But he did recently get quoted in the Boston Globe, not because of that, but because he's an international student accepted by Harvard. He's having trouble getting a visa. And so it's possible that I won't get to meet with him because in the fall because of what the Thai authorities do, and it's possible that it'll be because of the American government. So another kind of connectedness of the world. And the final thing I'll say about what he's been doing lately, his friend Joshua Wong is in prison. He does things periodically to try to keep Joshua from feeling forgotten. His group recently raised funds for 2 essay prizes for youth writing on different things. They honor people within Thailand. But he says he's trying to raise money for a 3rd that will be in Joshua Wong's honor. And he recently, the group of them, organized a seminar on what's been happening in South Korea, where they don't drink their tea with milk, but they're kind of considered an honorary member of the Milk Tea Alliance. Because in South Korea, in December, right after I finished the book, there was martial law declared. And then there was a successful protest against martial law. And politicians and protesters together blocked martial law and actually ended up impeaching the person responsible for it. So Netowitz, who often in the past has thought about drawing inspiration from the United States or from Hong Kong for different kinds of things that people have done, the group of them organized a thing to learn more about South Korea to see what tips they could have from there about extending democracy in their country.
Thank you for the update, and I hope that he gets to come to Harvard, especially what you didn't mention is the new policy of not accepting foreign students and the war that Harvard is in. So when we look at the global protest movements around the world, one thing that is clear, right after the streets protests are over, we see that the culture perseveres and exists, especially online. And my question is, what are some cultural trends or peculiarities that you observe in the region which you focus on?
So yeah, the afterlives of movements I think are very important and a way of thinking in kind of a long-term thing. And the story in these 3 places, I mean, I wish the South Korean events had happened before I finished the book, because then I could have ended on a fairly hopeful note of saying, because none of the 3 movements that I'm describing have succeeded. But to say that there are times when things seem to have failed but ultimately succeed, South Korea would have been a great example, because for decades there were efforts to end a right-wing dictatorship there, which always failed, but then succeeded, and then bequeathed something in this kind of protest culture that could live on. The Hong Kong story, culturally, what's happened is there's no space for protests within Hong Kong, but the story of Hong Kong has become largely people engage in small acts of resistance within a very tightly controlled, more tightly controlled setting. But the diaspora have been creating sort of elements, trying to keep elements of Hong Kong culture, including the protest culture, alive outside of the place. So the Hong Kong story has gone global in that sense, of pockets of Hong Kongers abroad in London, in various parts of England and Canada and other places, who try to keep alive things like, in Hong Kong, one of the things that marked Hong Kong as being different from other parts of the People's Republic of China was that only in Hong Kong and Macau could you commemorate the Tiananmen, the killings of 1989 in Beijing. You couldn't mark those in Beijing. There couldn't be public mourning, but in Hong Kong you could have that public mourning. Now you can't have that in Hong Kong or Macau, but Hong Kongers abroad on June 4th, they commemorate that. They also commemorate anniversaries of things specific to repression in Hong Kong. In Thailand, there are efforts to keep alive some of the symbols and some of the energy of the protests through things like, Samyen Press, that Netuit and others are part of, publishes things about what's happened in the past and what's happened not just in their country, but in others that they think are relevant for people in Thailand to learn about. When I was there, they have a place, they run a cafe called Delicious Democracy, which when I asked Netuit in a text if there was anything I could say about his recent activities related to Burma, he said, well, we have Burmese dishes as well as Thai dishes at Delicious Democracy. Do you know that? And we are working on publishing more things about Burma in Samyen Press. But there's sort of the publications is a way of doing that. But one of the things you can do if you run out of space to work on big movements is sometimes you can work on smaller things. And they're all involved in a anti-gentrification drive to try to save a local temple that's important to the local community, that's being at the center of a major development drive done by Chulalongkorn University, the university they were all students at, which is a big property developer in league with property developers. So they've been trying to organize to protect that temple and collect oral histories of the community that it's part of, where Delicious Democracy is part of it there. They're also working, they brought one of their things, and the translator is standing next to Netuit, is one of his close friends, and it was one of the lead faces of feminist activism in 2020 in Thailand. But she translated for this group, Samyen Press, Rebecca Solnit's Men Explain Things to Me. So if anybody in Thailand knows about mansplaining, it's because of the translation that Samyen Press brought out. And when I was at Delicious Democracy in beginning of 2024, they were talking about, they had this bookshelves upstairs full of all the books they've collected or interested in, the largest collection of Rebecca Solnit books I've ever seen, and they want to translate her Hope in the Dark. So there's a way in which they see their kind of literary and other activities as part of what's continued things on.
So that's really amazing to see how personal connections between activists would enable and highlight one cultural narrative and on the other. And as a Belarusian, I listen to Thai publishing house with a bit of an envy, because in our country we have no independent publishing left, and it would be unthinkable to open a cafe called Delicious Democracy. It just tells me right away that the level of freedoms there is slightly higher than what my community is experiencing experience, and which is great.
Can I bring in one thing about Belarus? Because I want to say one of the things that was seems so amazingly appropriate of having you be part of this is that, and we've collaborated on the creation and curating of this presentation, so Sasha deserves a lot of the credit for how it goes. But in 2020, when Thai students were looking to Hong Kong for inspiration in part, Belarus had a protest that was very similar to the Thai protests. In 2020, the Thai protests were because there was a junta that had allowed an election to take place, but had made the opposition party that did it surprisingly well in the election illegal right afterwards. And there was a very parallel kind of thing in Belarus, a 2019 election, and then a continuity of dictatorial rule, even though there had been such mass support for the opposition. And so there were protests in Belarus where there was some looking to Hong Kong for stylistic tips, for slogans, for a variety of things. And there was a similar kind of connection of that. I've got to admit, I was not following the news from Belarus, but Netuit was, and wrote a piece, we Thais stand with Belarus, do they stand with us, drawing attention to this kind of thing. So it's been, actually, working on Netuit has been quite humbling, because I think no matter how much somebody from, somebody with my kind of background thinks like, yeah, I study the world and protest globally, I expect to be more globally minded than this son of Bangkok shopkeepers.
That's a humbling story, and I'm so glad that we're finally learning in depth about these things. So Jeff, you talked about publishing, but what about music? You have a lot about music and musical movements in your book. So what makes a music such a transnational language of dissent, and why is it important? Yeah.
So music is very important to me, and for a variety of reasons, but one is sort of the first memory that I have of a protest was being a kid taken to a protest quite near here against the war in Vietnam, where Joan Baez sang. And you know, there was a way in which music kind of went together for this. When I was doing Vigil, the book on Hong Kong, my collaborator on that, Amy Hawkins, wonderful, now covering China for The Guardian, a wonderful journalist, we asked people in Hong Kong involved in the movement if there was any novel or film that they thought spoke to Hong Kong's situation right then. And we got some really interesting answers, like 1984, kind of obviously, but we also got Titanic, because somebody said the film Titanic because the ship's going down, but some people are just going to party and others are going to try to save themselves. But when I was starting work on this, I thought, you know, I'll ask people what songs matter to them. And I knew that in the Hong Kong case, You Hear the People Sing was a globally circulating one. They sang it in Minsk during the Belarus protests. But I also thought of it, it's something also that is, when you sing a song in another language, the translation has to work. So there often are sort of localization things in the translation. And one of the things when Hong Kong people sing in Cantonese, Do You Hear the People Sing, as the poet Tammy Ho alerted me in a blog post she did, it becomes who has not spoken up yet. So it's basically saying, in Cantonese, it's saying, of course they're not going to listen to us, but don't you want to be remembered as one of the people who tried to get them to listen, which is a different meaning. So when there are things in translation, they go that way. And then when I heard about, you know, rap against dictatorship, rap against junta, and then these groups got together and did something that reminds me, though it's very different, of a kind of We Are the World of rap music across Asia, the Milk Tea Alliance song, where different rappers would take from different countries or different parts of the region would take a verse and talk about what they were complaining about. It was called Dictators Must Die. And so they had a similar anti-autocratic thing. There are a lot of three-finger salutes, but they also localize it. The Thai rapper says, get away, you old man, it's time for a new gen. So I was just fascinated by these connections. But so when I ask people what songs matter to them, I expected to get some answers. I expected to get, do you hear the people saying? I got that. I expected to get some very local, specific answers. Got that from some Thai activists. They said, you know, songs that were important in the 1980s and 90s were singing on the streets again. In Hong Kong, you'll hear as you file out at the end of this, we've still got a lot to go. We've still got questions and things. But when you leave, there'll be a song, Glory to Hong Kong, playing that was written by Hong Kong activists as a kind of way. It became an anthem, but almost a protest anthem, but almost like a proto-national anthem for a place in Hong Kong. So it became completely banned, and you couldn't sing it in Hong Kong after the crackdown. So one Thai activist, another way of how music can show up in different ways, a Thai activist went outside the Chinese embassy in Bangkok on Chinese National Day and sang Glory to Hong Kong, this song that's banned in Hong Kong, but it's called protest swapping in the literature. He was doing something in solidarity with people someplace else that wasn't illegal in his place, even though it was illegal in theirs. So they're just great stories about music. But what I know you're probably wondering is, since I'm so obsessed with Netuit, what is the song that means the most to him? I asked him that, and I had a lot of possible things I expected him to say. He said he likes, do you hear the people saying, that's fine. But what he really likes is We Shall Overcome. And one of his heroes is Pete Seeger. And he said, he's a conscientious regret. He said he really likes, well, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And when he said, by the way, I was a Pete Seeger fan from my teenage years. And when Pete Seeger died in 2014, Netuit and some of his friends, who at this point are in their late teens, organized a memorial concert in Pete Seeger's honor, as also a way of talking about things that you could talk about through talking about an American songwriter that you maybe couldn't talk about talking about ones in Thailand. And so I said, okay, so Pete Seeger, this is great. You know, I'm amazed that I'm having this exchange with you about Pete Seeger. Do you like any other American songwriter? He goes, Woody Guthrie. I said, okay, This Land Is Your Land. It's great, totally expected. I said, okay, so you could hear, and how did you know about them? He said, well, because when he was a secondary school activist, you know, trying to look for guidance, he was watching documentaries about the American Civil Rights Movement, and he was very fascinated with Martin Luther King. One of the first things he translated was Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and there were these songs, and he learned about Pete Seeger and things like that. I said, okay, so you know about Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, and then he paused and he goes, oh, and Leadbelly. You know, so music also is a way just of keeping you have to keep your spirits up during a movement, and singing is a good way to do it. You also have to keep your spirits up when you're working on stories that haven't ended happily yet, or have ended very sadly. And I haven't talked enough about Burma, but you know, this has been a country that's gone through such a series of different forms of horrific kind of oppression. And there too, I talk about one of the Burmese activists, how important music has been to him. So that's important too.
Thank you so much. And it certainly shows you all the transnational connections. And I also grew up with American music. As a kid, I listened to The Doors and Jim Morrison, and that was it. And I think I chose Los Angeles just because of that. Okay. So another question, because I do write on Belarusian activists quite a bit and work with the artists in the community, but every time I work with someone, my big dilemma is, am I helping them or am I causing harm by exposing them? And the methodological question is very, very serious, and many people actually opt out from their names being mentioned in the program, so they come in with different names because it's that dangerous. So how do you work with activists, and what are some dilemmas that you've been working through in these projects?
It's an enormous issue, and with the case of the people that I profile are mostly people who have already been fairly public about what their stances are. And so if there is, you know, Netuit shares constantly in a kind of public way. So I feel like if there's anything he wouldn't want me to, there's some basic things. I communicate using Signal rather than, I don't use regular emails when I'm doing things. They're basic kind of things. With the two Burmese exiles I talked to, they too are, who I profile, they too are people who've been quite public about them. One of them who has the extraordinary, goes by the extraordinary name of Nikki Diamond, is in Germany getting a PhD. And so these are people who have a kind of publicness. It was very, very hard with the Hong Kong story. I wanted to have Hong Kong in the story because I view this book as a companion book to Vigil, but I know that people aren't, it's kind of a sequel, but I know there are people who are not going to have read Vigil, and I hope they can make sense of it. So I have a short chapter on Hong Kong, and it deals with Agnes Chow, who is trying to keep a low profile. She's finally gotten out of Hong Kong, and she's in Toronto. And so one of the things I did was not interview her for the book, because I felt this is one where she's navigating a complex situation. I had met with her in 2018, in 2017 or 2018 at UCLA. I could draw on having been in the same room with her. I had watched a lot of documentary footage with her, but I felt this was, and there were other people in the Hong Kong story who are trying to navigate in various ways. And the main ethical dilemma I've dealt with isn't actually about the people I profile, because it's done carefully. But the main ethical dilemma is I would have loved to go back to Hong Kong when I was working on this book. And I just felt it wouldn't be right to do that, because I had written the previous book. I would be watched. I mean, I probably wouldn't have a problem getting in. I might be interrogated, I don't know, but I would definitely be watched, and there are people I would want to see, including just friends, but also to talk about things that if I went there, I would want to spend time doing things that I'd be somewhat toxic to them. So that was, I think, the biggest ethical thing I thought about.
And I think you did right, and also by now high-profile activists are in exile, and people who are in Hong Kong are probably in prison. So it's very difficult. But I want to bring this conversation to back home. Right now in Los Angeles, we are going through very turbulent times ourselves, and with everything that's going on, what can Angelinas learn from your book? What lessons? Even though I want to say that United States remains a democracy, and any parallels that we draw, we need to be very cautious as scholars and historians in your case. But what can we learn from the Milk Tea Alliance here?
Yeah, well, I think I've already mentioned one thing, which is I think simply what Netawit and his group are doing, of like thinking about a place where in some ways a parallel thing has happened, and sort of learning more about it is actually one of the structural things. For me, working on the book and thinking about my previous book while things are going on in the US, I was just struck by how things that can seem were kind of hard to relate to at a certain moment seem easier to. So the Hong Kong protests, the biggest protests, the ones of 2019, started with concern about an extradition law. And it seemed a very kind of legalistic, technical thing to have focused on, but we know about how much there can be things. One of the last protests I saw in Hong Kong before I finished writing the book was in June of 2019, and it was a protest by lawyers who dressed in black and had a silent protest because of the kind of impending end of rule of law. So I think the idea of just what the stakes are for things like separations of powers, rule of law, judicial independence, I think those are things that, it's after the fact, but these are things that there were activists there who were saying it's not even just about elections, it's also about these things that are very precious.
Thank you, thank you. And my last question before we open the floor to the audience is about envisioning future. Despite a very bad crackdown on the protests in the 3 countries that you talk about, and the heavy toll that the civil society had to pay over there, the tone of your book, the tonality is very hopeful. So could you talk about the sources of hope and where would hope come from?
Yeah, so hope is a very central thing. And I mentioned that, the Thai activists wanting to translate Hope in the Dark, which is a book specifically about how you think of that. One is from a long-term perspective, that I don't believe that history, I don't believe in the arc of history and things like that. But I do think there are lots of times in the past when struggles looked as though they were never going to succeed, never going to succeed, never going to succeed. At some point they did. Something might have had to change in the world, and things like that. So I actually read a lot, and we share a fascination with Adam Michnik and some of the other figures of protests against Moscow. If you tell the story of the Cold War and protests in the Soviet bloc, you would say 1956 crushed in Hungary, and the Wenda Museum does wonderful things on many of the things I'm going to mention. 1968, you have Prague Spring, and it's crushed by tanks, and some people are so dispirited that a young person, young Polak, self-immolates because he just doesn't see any future for somebody like him in his native land. But then you have 1980, Solidarity is this amazing things and seems to succeed, and then it gets crushed. But then you have 1989. And actually one of the things, the protests that begin, that end up with the Velvet Revolution that brings Havel to power, so surprisingly, was a 20th anniversary of Jan Palach's self-immolation. So you think of this kind of interplay between these very dark moments, but then ways in which something can happen that was unexpected and not giving out. And this hasn't happened in the stories in Thailand and Hong Kong, in Burma. It's very hard to see that as a kind of hopeful ending, but we do have, in South Korea, there were decades when it didn't seem it was going to go anywhere, and now they're fighting to protect a democracy rather than get one. Taiwan was under martial law for decades, and actually there was a massacre not unlike in some ways the Tiananmen one in 1947 in Taiwan that for decades afterwards you couldn't talk about until finally you could. So I think looking at historical perspective is one of the ways to keep hope alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.